Some corridors erase names on purpose, others etch them in stone. The men and women who would later raise a hand to swear an oath had already learned what a key sounds like in a lock, long before anyone called them Mr. President. That is not a metaphor from a screenplay. It is the aftertaste of regimes that gambled everything on the idea that a cell could make history disappear. Hold the map in your mind for a moment. Pretend the borders are thinner than paper. On one continent, a lawyer accepts a life sentence as if he is accepting a brief that will outlive the judge. On another, a playwright is sentenced for subversion because his words refuse to behave. On still another, a young medical student becomes a prisoner number because knocks at the door arrived before dawn. The pattern is not destiny, it is pressure. And the most unnerving part is how often the machinery assumed it had won. Latter, some societies would try to wash the stain through amnesty fights, truth commissions, and fragile bargains about punishment. The details vary by country, but the emotional weather repeats. Shame collides with political math. But that was not the real turning point for South Africa. The real turning point arrived when the state tried to turn Nelson Mandela into a cautionary tale, and instead handed him time to become inevitable. By 1964, the Rivonia trial had already done something the prosecutors did not intend. It codified Mandela as a symbol. The sentence was life. The cell on Robben Island became routine in the brutal, ordinary sense. Limestone dust, censored letters, work in the quarry that stole light from the eyes. Years folded into other years with a bureaucratic patience that can break a person by boredom as surely as by violence. He was not frozen in myth. He studied, organized, argued, and learned Afrikaans with a discipline that unnerved captors who preferred a simpler story. Medical records and survivor accounts also carry the smaller brutalities. Eye strain from glare off pale limestone. The body paying interest on forced labor long after speeches are written. Outside the walls, sanctions, sports bans, and divestment campaigns turned private shame into public leverage until isolation became expensive for the regime that claimed it loved order. At the time, no one realized how much the world was rehearsing its own memory. Isolation was supposed to shrink him. It widened him. And then something unexpected happened in the calculus of power. The government that jailed him eventually faced a truth that jail cannot manufacture. Apartheid was bleeding credibility faster than it could patch propaganda. Secret channels later entered the official record, proof that history's hinge is often greased in rooms without cameras. When Mandela walked into freedom in 1990, cameras trembled as if light itself was nervous. Less than 4 years later, in 1994, the same man who had been issued prison clothing took the oath as South Africa's first black president. The irony is almost too clean to trust, except it is documented until the margins complain. His presidency would pair reconciliation with difficult truth-telling, a combination scholars still weigh for what it healed and what it postponed. But that was not the end of the paradox. Across the Pacific, another democracy would later crown a man who had already looked down a path the state called a finish line. South Korea's Kim Dae-jung carried a biography that reads like a political thriller written against his will. In 1973, in Tokyo, he was seized in an operation that later fed investigations, diplomatic unease, and long arguments about what powerful friends knew while paperwork moved through embassies. After the military crackdown that followed the Gwangu uprising, he was swept into a trial where survival itself was framed as a concession. A death sentence loomed with the grim practicality of a stamped form. International pressure and shifting tides inside the regime rewrote the immediate outcome. Scholars still debate which lever moved first. What remains undisputed is the through line. Kim did not emerge unscathed. He carried exile, surveillance, repeated electoral defeat, and the kind of stamina that looks like stubbornness until history calls it foresight. In 1998, he became president at an age when many leaders are already polishing memoirs. History remembers the Nobel Peace Prize in 2000 as part of his later presidency, a luminous footnote that can distract from the darker earlier chapters. His approach to the North remains debated as strategy, yet the personal arc still cuts cleanly. A man once marked for execution sat in the seat where generals once expected his silence. What came next was even more significant for anyone who thinks prisons only belong to distant republics with old uniforms. Europe had its own version of the same moral test. Vaclav Havel was not a general. He was a playwright whose essays irritated a system that wanted citizens to speak in a single approved tense. He helped give Charter 77 its public moral spine. The civic initiative that insisted dignity was not a favor the state could grant and revoke on a whim. In 1979, a court sentenced him on a subversion charge that turned thought into evidence. He spent roughly 4 years inside, illness and international attention eventually contributing to his release by 1983. That was not the real turning point either. The deeper hinge arrived later when ordinary people in Czechoslovakia decided tiredness was no longer a private feeling. In the Velvet Revolution days of 1989, the dissident habit of saying no became a countrywide chorus. In Prague, citizens rattled keys in the November air, a metallic sound used as a public vote of no confidence in brittle authority. Havel moved from prison typography to presidential speeches with a speed that still feels cinematic. Except the bruises were real. He became president in a drama he would have refused as too neat if someone had pitched it on a stage. South America adds a different textured dirt under the fingernails, a long echo of dictatorship, and a reminder that mercy is sometimes just the slow return of daylight. José Mujica belonged to a moment when young idealists collided with a machine that answered ideas with disappearance. Uruguay's coup in 1973 turned dissent into a family risk measured in midnight knocks. Captured as part of the Tupamaro guerrilla movement, Mujica endured years that read like a catalog of endurance tests, isolation, solitude, rumor of death. Conditions survivors describe in blunt physical language that no archive can soften. Democracy's return did not arrive as a gentle sunrise. It arrived as a reckoning. Years later, when Uruguay chose him as president, beginning in 2010, his persona carried the residue of a man who had been lowered into the ground while still breathing. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, like the video and subscribe for more weekly breakdowns that move at this same human pace. Michelle Bachelet's story tightens the theme until it almost hurts, because the violence was not abstract. Under Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship, she and her mother were taken into the secretive apparatus that made fear into architecture. Villa Grimaldi was not a courtroom. It was a place where interrogation swallowed routines, where detainees became files, where survival left silences that public language still struggles to carry. Her father, Air Force General Alberto Bachelet, died in custody after the dictatorship punished him for refusing to accept the coup's arithmetic. Michelle Bachelet went into exile. The road back was medicine, service, and an unflashy refusal to let trauma be the last word. When Chile elected her president, first taking office in 2006, the ballot was not only a choice of leader, it was a societal exhale that admitted a past it had long tried to neaten. Years later, she would walk the world stage in United Nations corridors, another bright hall with different rules, proof that a presidency can be a midpoint rather than a finale. Historians debate emphasis on every biography. They argue about how much personal suffering should weigh against policy, how much symbolism inflates a finite human being. Fair enough. What the records agree on is narrower and sharper. These leaders were labeled enemies before they were labeled executives. But that was not the end of why this matters. Institutions measure their own strength by how they treat the inconvenient mind. Democracies and dictatorships both face a recurring temptation: convert a person into a lesson, then lock the lesson in concrete. The stories that follow from Mandela's quarry to Havel's pages, from Kim's narrow escapes to Mujica's isolation, from Bachelet's stolen mornings to the oath each would later swear, all return to one stubborn fact. Cells change bodies first. Sometimes they change calendars. Occasionally, if the world is paying attention, they change what citizens believe is possible. At the time, no one realized how many future presidents were being trained in patience that no campaign ad can fake. That hindsight should land with weight, not comfort. History is not a vending machine that guarantees redemption. It is a ledger where some names survive erasure because ordinary people refuse to look away. What happened next in the broader sweep is that elections arrived as contests and verdicts at once. Leaders who had been stamped as criminals stepped into offices where their portraits would hang in the same hallways that once housed their warrants. The gaze of a camera loves a parade. Memory prefers the slower file, the guard's boots, the ink on a verdict, the sound when metal agrees with metal. So let the map fold back into a single truth without romance. Prison did not make them wise by magic. Suffering is not a credential. Power did not apologize politely and hand them roses. Still, the contradiction remains like heat lightning. The same states or the successor states that inherited their ledgers sometimes placed handcuffed citizens into the only story that could not be staged away. And years later, those same citizens stood under chandeliers, voices steady, proof that survival is not a straight line and leadership is not only born in privilege. The final frame is not applause. It is accountability humming beneath ceremony, the knowledge that democracy's benchmark is not perfection. It is whether a society can face what it did to people before it asks them to lead. That is the hinge history keeps testing. And when the latch turns again somewhere unseen, the sound will be familiar to anyone who has listened closely to this story. The point is not nostalgia for suffering. The point is steadiness. When a society forgets how easily a name can become a number, It rehearses the old mistake with new uniforms and newer excuses. Their journey proves that a prison cell isn't a dead end. It is a crucible for leadership.